Student free speech is defended not just adequately, but joyfully and fully by our schools. Contrary to what my opponent may say, in the overwhelming majority of schools, free speech is not something frowned upon, but something that is cherished. In the past, student free speech was not guaranteed, but the Supreme Court ruling of Tinker v. Des Moines changed all of that. Although it wasn't adequately protected in the past, today this right is defended vigorously by schools across America. With few exceptions, our schools have both honored and defended these rights religiously, and for good reason. Limiting free speech would leave schools especially vulnerable to legal action. This can be seen in multiple sources that my opponent may use. One such example, in a New York Times article, involves athletes kneeling during the national anthem at a high school football game. These students were threatened with removal from the team if they didn't comply with not kneeling. Almost immediately, this school was threatened with a lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union. The threat of litigation in general has caused schools to be much more cautious in their decisions regarding free speech. Not limiting free speech also has a massive upside to schools. It keeps students both happy and learning. When students can express their opinions freely within the limitations of the Constitution, there's less tension in schools. This lends itself to more effective learning. Schools would be ruining a great thing by limiting free speech. This leads me to the reason why schools limit free speech. In past Supreme Court cases, there have been three integral issues: direct conflicts with beliefs, misinterpreting disruptive free speech, and forced religious activities. All occur because the beliefs of a school official conflict with the beliefs of the student, whether religious, political, or otherwise. I think that we can all agree that such actions have no place in our schools. While this disdain for violations of free speech is justified, you must recognize that schools don't frequently violate student rights. By limiting free speech, schools would simply be shooting themselves in the foot. The possibilities of litigation and the effect on the student body are constant and imminent when dealing with free speech. No school official, when properly weighing the consequences, would infringe on free speech. That's why it doesn't happen often. My opponent will try to give you myriad examples of free speech limitations, but if my opponent needs to give specific violations, these violations do not occur often. The news headlines that these stories create merely create an illusion of widespread injustice. There are never articles about schools supporting free speech. Those aren't controversial. You would never see articles about things like Fairfax County Public Schools allowing students one excused absence for civil activities. Consider the positives of student free speech and the negatives that are avoided. The likelihood that school officials would reach a consensus on violating a student's rights is very slim. Violations only occur in areas of mistake or through purposeful malicious acts by school administrations. How many schools do you think are willing to risk lawsuits, losing student respect, teacher respect, and massive press criticism to violate a singular student's rights? Thank you.
In 2017, Colin Kaepernick's protest of racial injustice inspired high school athletes across the country. Several teams, in an effort to avoid controversy, decided to crack down on students that knelt for the national anthem. According to a New York Times article, a district in Long Island claimed that students would face serious disciplinary action if they chose to partake in these protests. A school in Louisiana declared that it is a choice, not a right, for students to participate in school-sanctioned extracurricular activities. Marjorie Essman, the executive director of the ACLU in Louisiana, warned, "The law does not permit schools to forbid students from expressing their views, and all schools should be on notice that these policies are in fact unconstitutional. Students' rights to free speech should be vigorously protected. The affirmative will tell you that adequate means good enough, that if schools have acceptable but not remarkable responses to free speech cases, that they are adequately protecting students' rights. This simply is not true. Schools owe it to their students to teach them about the First Amendment. They ought to be advocating for our right to share our beliefs, so long as they do not harm anyone, instead of censoring ideas that our peers may disagree with. I believe that Tinker v. Des Moines said it best. The vigilant protection of constitutional freedoms is nowhere more vital than in the community of American schools. The classroom is the marketplace of ideas. The nation's future depends upon leaders trained through a wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas, which discovers truth out of a multitude of tongues, rather than through any type of authoritative selection. In other words, the future leaders and participants in a democracy must be able to share their ideas. And where better to learn to do so than in a classroom? So what speech should be protected by school? According to Tinker v. Des Moines, the answer is any speech that will not cause disruption to a learning environment. In 1965, Mary Beth Tinker was suspended for wearing a black armband to school to protest the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court ruled in her favor, declaring that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. This landmark case has clarified schools' responsibility in free speech situations since then. Basically, schools can only discipline students if the speech would or did cause, quote, material and substantial disruption. According to a Washington Post article, cheerleaders in Texas replaced racist and violent messages on their banners with religious messages. The only complaint came from an anti-religion advocacy group, but that was reason enough for their superintendent to issue a rule banning all such religious speech. The cheerleaders sued the school, and the court ruled that because students are private citizens, not agents of the school, that they have the right to express their religious views. The school did not protect students' rights. It took intervention from a court to bring justice to these students. Free speech rights in schools have become more complex due to social media. Instead of fostering a so-called marketplace of ideas, schools have taken it upon themselves to censor those who complain about the district outside of school hours. If the speech does not cause disruption, then it cannot be controlled by the school. Nevertheless, schools have tried to violate students' right to free speech. For example, in 2012, a student was forced to turn over her Facebook password to the school in the presence of police after posting that a hall monitor was, quote, mean to her. In Kansas, a student was suspended over a tweet making fun of his school's football team. Both examples are unacceptable. The school did not have the jurisdiction to discipline either one of these students, considering that it happened off of school grounds and that it was not violent speech. Let me be clear. The fact that these situations have occurred at all means that schools are not robustly protecting students' rights. Free speech in schools is essential. Our democracy thrives on the fact that every citizen is allowed to have an opinion. Our educational system is made better by students sharing their opinions. It is easy for schools to respond with human biases and emotions when dealing with controversial situations. And quite frankly, districts have been doing it for years. But we are better than that. It is past time for schools to merely have a good enough approach to handling free speech. It is time for schools to robustly protect student rights. Thank you.
As students, I'm sure we can all agree that we have several different rights that need to be protected when we're at school. One of these rights is the right to privacy, and it is the school's job to protect the students' privacy, especially at this day and age when so many of us have our own private technology and personal belongings. It is crucial that schools do an adequate job protecting a student's right to privacy, and they have. With a strong need to protect the student's right, there lies an important question. What exactly does a student's right to privacy entail? Simply put, a student's right to privacy generally includes education records, privacy in changing rooms or restrooms, personal belongings, and different forms of misconduct. For example, a student's right to privacy is violated when personal information is disclosed to unauthorized third parties without consent, or when a student faces an unauthorized search of their locker or backpack. I think most people would generally agree that when it comes to keeping students' grades and personal information private, schools do a very good job. They don't disclose any information on students' grades in different classes, nor do they share with anyone a student's address or personal information. The problem for most lies in the search of students' lockers and backpacks. As I'm sure many people will point out, there have been several instances where schools have seemingly invaded students' privacy. Locker searches, backpack searches, and even the search through someone's phone and social media accounts. Under the right circumstances, these can all be invasions of students' privacy. But most of the time, these backpack and locker searches have probable cause, meaning it's not an invasion of privacy. The National School Board estimates that more than 135,000 guns are brought to school each day. Students who bring these weapons to school hide them in things like their lockers and book bags. When schools are informed of situations like this, they have every right to search the locker or backpack of the student. This is not an invasion of privacy, as the schools have reason to believe that this particular student is putting other students in danger. I'm sure that there have been cases where there was no probable cause for the search of a student's locker or backpack, but these cases are few and far between. They don't happen often enough for people to say that schools are constantly invading students' privacy or aren't adequately protecting that right to privacy. It should also be noted that the lockers are considered the school's property, and it's because of this that the school can actually search students' lockers without a reason. It's completely within the law for the school to go through a student's locker, regardless of if they have a reason or not. A more recent question on the right to privacy arose with COVID-19. Schools had a fine line to walk when quarantining students. On one hand, the student who contracted the virus is entitled to privacy. The school can't go around telling people that the student is sick without their consent because it's their own private business. On the other hand, however, the student who's being quarantined would want to know who they came in contact with that contracted the virus. Balancing the sick student's right to privacy with the other student's right to know, especially when it's a safety concern, is difficult. However, even with this difficulty, schools have done an adequate job of balancing the two and protecting a student's right to privacy, while also giving the other student the proper information. Schools have a lot to be concerned with when it comes to students' rights, especially a student's right to privacy. At times, it's difficult to walk the line between a student's right to privacy and a student's safety. But even with this struggle, schools do a great job at protecting a student's right to privacy, which is a part of students' rights in general, meaning that in spite of what a lot of people may think, schools do adequately protect students' rights. Thank you.
As an American, we have a number of rights that we choose to exercise every day. We are very fortunate to live in a place where protecting rights is the government's #1 priority. Even though this is true, there have been numerous times over our country's long history that these rights have been taken from us. For the last 250 years, the United States has fought for its rights, whether that meant throwing tea into the Boston Harbor due to an unfair tax, or marching on Washington protesting the discrimination against African Americans. All of this work fighting for the rights of the little guy, and we still aren't perfect. This is present today, especially in our schools. Countless times in our country's history, our rights as students have been infringed upon. One of those cases being Barnett versus West Virginia Board of Education in 1943. This case was a conflict between children and a family of Jehovah's Witnesses and the school making the kids stand for the pledge. When the students did not stand, they were sent home for non-compliance and were threatened to be forced to go to a reform school for criminally active children. Their parents were also criminally prosecuted for inciting the children's actions. This case then went to the Supreme Court and ruled that compelling school children to stand for the flag was unconstitutional. After this groundbreaking case, you would think it would set a precedent for schools for the future and schools around the country, but schools have still not adequately protected the students' rights from this ruling. An example of these rights being broken would be in 2017, an 11-year-old Florida student was faced with a misdemeanor charge for not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. The police said that the student was creating a, quote, disturbance in the classroom. The student's reason for not standing was because he felt that the pledge was racist towards African Americans. Looking back to the 1943 ruling, the actions taken by this school district were both unconstitutional and immoral. Why should an 11-year-old face such harsh charges for something like not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance? I think it seems a little bit excessive. Responding to this controversial statement, the ACLU of Florida stated that this is outrageous. Students do not lose their First Amendment rights when they enter the schoolhouse gates. More recently, at Lebanon School District in Pennsylvania, a student is suing the school district because the school violated his rights to freedom of speech. According to PennLive.com, the student did not stand for the Pledge of Allegiance because it did not align with his, quote, religious and political beliefs. The first time the student didn't stand, the lawsuit says that he, quote, sat quietly and respectfully, causing no disturbance. When the teacher finally told him to stand up and he refused, he was sent to the principal's office. From there, the principal proceeded to, quote, interrogate him about his actions. Every additional time this student chose not to participate, he has not only faced academic harm, but also suffered from stigma and embarrassment from his fellow students. The student and his father are fighting the school district in court, stating that the school's punishment of his son was unconstitutional. Even though the ruling of Barnett versus West Virginia Board of Education hoped to set a precedent in students' rights, numerous times since then, the students' rights have been taken from them unjustly. As a country, we aren't perfect and need to do better. This is why we, the negative side, believe that schools have not and do not adequately protect students' rights. Thank you.
I want everyone to take a second during this debate and think about how you, and only you, have been treated in this school regarding your rights. Has anything major happened to you? Probably not. Blackhawk and other high schools have done an adequate job protecting our student rights. Let's rewind and really look at the meaning of adequate. In Webster's dictionary, adequate means something that is sufficient for a specific need or requirement. Synonyms include acceptable, decent, and respectable. So, do schools, including the teachers, administration, and other staff members, do at the least a decent job protecting our rights? Definitely. All high schools provide a learning environment that not only satisfies our educational needs, but also our safety and constitutional rights. However, if there are any problems, our school can work with us students to address the issues we may have about our rights. A few weeks back, our senior class president, Ian Tweed, conducted an interview with Mr. Ford concerning a possible issue at Blackhawk High School. Mr. Ford explained how the administration is willing to listen to students' opinions and have a conversation to improve things. One year, Mr. Ford was approached by a student who wanted to have a walkout for student rights. He and Mr. Nelson met with a group of kids to organize an assembly to discuss these issues on student rights. This shows that Blackhawk's administration, in the past and present, is here for us and wants to help. I get it. There are examples where students weren't treated well. Nobody is perfect and everyone makes mistakes. My partner explained to you that these incidents don't happen frequently. And it's true. In 4 years of high school, I haven't witnessed a problem on free speech in or out of these walls. The Supreme Court case, Tinker versus Des Moines, that we had to memorize in government sophomore year, set a precedent to focus on protecting student rights. Schools then and now want to keep a balance between letting students express themselves while not breaking the law. Like free speech, schools do an adequate job of protecting the right of privacy. My other partner explained to you how schools protect the rights of student belongings, such as their phones, backpacks, and lockers. However, there are various situations where searches need to be conducted. For example, if there are any suspicions about a student bringing a dangerous weapon, the school has every right to hold searches. It's better to be safe than sorry. Also, with the recent pandemic going on, the school has the right to trace students. Schools have done a great job of keeping track of students to prevent the virus from spreading. This tracking helps students stay at school and helps avoid another shutdown. Schools respect our privacy as long as it doesn't interfere with our safety. As you can see, American high schools in the past and present have certainly done an adequate job at protecting students' rights. Incidents relating to freedom of speech and privacy don't happen often, and they are usually mistakes. If there is a problem, school administrations are willing to listen and do anything for their students. Think about it. All of our teachers, staff, and district employees want the best for us and care about us. So why would they take our rights away? Thank you.
Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. This decision is of the 1969 Tinker v. Des Moines Supreme Court case, which still stands today. Yet 52 years later, schools continue to violate the rights of students' freedom of speech, expression, and their right to equal opportunity. One violation of a student's rights is too many. Schools have the right to protect their students and to prevent distractions in order to create an educational environment. But how far are these rights able to stretch before they infringe on the rights of their students? What constitutes a distraction in a school when students are being sent home for dress code violations that are as minor as revealing a bra strap or showing their shoulders? To determine that these individuals' level of education must decrease over the possibility of a distraction is absurd. When a school's roles lead to the improper marginalization of their students due to unfairly targeting them based on specific genders, races, gender fluidity, sexual orientations, cultures, religions, or body types, there is an injustice within the school system that is creating a barrier between the student and their education. Does this not constitute as more of a distraction? Now, some clothing is said to be a distraction to the learning of other students. This is commonly said when referring to women lending themselves to be a possible distraction to their male classmates. This logic is very clearly flawed, outdated, and sexist. Many dress codes unfairly target female students. If a 10-year-old girl wears a tank top to school, this should be in no way seen as seductive or disrespectful. It is simply a tank top. What is more distracting than shoulders or a bit of midriff is the valuable class time lost when a student is dress coded. By sending a student to the nurse's office or for a change of clothes or even possibly sending them home, this is creating a far more drastic distraction than the possibility of a distraction. Now, schools are able to bypass some rights by declaring something as an interruption to the learning environment of students. But how much leeway can be given before the school abuses this power and instead uses it as a way to push political views, reveal racist ideals, force religious ideologies, and sexism? Was Deanna and Maya Scott's box braids really such a distraction that they must be given a detention along with being pulled from their sports and denied entry to prom? Was Chelsea Carr's hair really such a distraction that he was not allowed to be enrolled in his junior year of high school because it wasn't the typical boy hair? Was a student's hijab really such a distraction that she must be forced to take it off and be shamed for her beliefs? One instance of these clear violations to a student's rights of expression, equal opportunity, and religious freedoms is too many. Along with interruptions that hinder the learning of some students, some are not given the opportunity to participate in educational programs that may have otherwise been helpful to them. The well-known gifted and enrichment program helps to challenge students who seemingly have an above-average intelligence and are typically tested at a young age. But due to teacher bias and other factors, white students are being tested disproportionately higher than black students. While black students make up 17% of the total student population, they only account for 10% of all gifted students nationwide. Racialized tracking affects black students by sorting them out of educational opportunities. This academic tracking creates almost a school within a school, which was seen at a high school in New Jersey. 70% of the students that were in the advanced classes were white, while 70% of the students in lower classes were black. Now, this is not a case from years ago. This is happening in schools around us and in the country in real time. We have not yet reached a point where all public schools adequately protect the rights of their students. These instances cannot be seen as adequate or decent or respectable. They are affecting the level of education for students based on religion, gender, culture, and body type. When a school's rules affect a student's level of education, or limit a student's rights to expression, or take away religious freedoms, adequate protection isn't possible. One violation of a student's rights is too many. Thank you.